Thomas Bridger had saved exactly one life when he carried the starving Shoshone child to his ranch house. 8 days later, 450 warriors lined the ridge at dawn, and he didn't know if they had come to thank him or kill him. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Thomas Bridger had learned long ago that the frontier showed no mercy to the hesitant. At 42, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had spent decades under the unforgiving Wyoming sun, his hands calloused from years of working cattle and building a life from nothing more than determination and sweat. His ranch sat in a valley between two ridges, positioned perfectly to catch the morning light and shelter his livestock from the worst of the winter storms that regularly swept across the territory. It wasn't the largest spread in the region, but it was his, built with honest work and maintained with the kind of stubborn integrity that made other ranchers respect him even when they disagreed with his methods. The morning he found the child, Thomas had been riding the southern boundary of his property, checking fence lines after a particularly vicious storm had torn through the valley the night before. The wind had been fierce enough to rattle the windows of his farmhouse and send his horses into nervous circles in their corrals. Now, in the pale light of dawn, he surveyed the damage with the practiced eye of a man who had rebuilt more fences than he cared to count. 3 posts were down completely, and another dozen showed signs of stress that would need attention before the next storm arrived. He was dismounting to examine a damaged section when his horse, a reliable bay gelding named Copper, suddenly raised his head and nickered softly. The sound was different from his usual greeting, carrying a note of unease that made Thomas pause. Copper had been with him for 7 years, and Thomas had learned to trust the horse's instincts about danger. Indians, cougars, bears, Copper always knew when something wasn't right. Thomas reached for the rifle he kept secured to his saddle, his movements slow and deliberate. The territory had been relatively peaceful for the past 2 years, but tensions between settlers and the native tribes were never far from the surface. Land disputes, broken treaties, and violent encounters had created an atmosphere of mutual distrust that poisoned nearly every interaction between the two peoples. Thomas himself had tried to maintain respectful distance from the tribal lands, refusing to participate in the land grabs that had enriched some of his neighbors, while earning their eternal enmity from the Shoshone and Arapaho peoples who had lived in these valleys for generations. The sound that drew his attention was so faint he almost missed it, a small whimper that might have been mistaken for wind through the grass if Copper hadn't been staring fixedly at a cluster of rocks about 30 yards away. Thomas moved toward the sound with careful steps, his rifle ready but not raised, his eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of ambush or danger. What he found among those rocks would change the course of his life in ways he could never have imagined. The child was perhaps 6 or 7 years old, though malnutrition made it difficult to judge with certainty. She was native, dressed in what remained of traditional clothing that had been torn and stained by exposure and hardship. Her small body was curled into a defensive ball, her eyes enormous in a face that was little more than skin stretched over delicate bones. Those eyes watched him with the wary intelligence of a wild creature that had learned the hard way that survival depended on constant vigilance. She didn't try to run when he approached, and Thomas realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach that she probably lacked the strength to flee even if she had wanted to. Thomas lowered his rifle immediately, setting it carefully on the ground several feet away. He raised his hands slowly, palms out, trying to convey that he meant no harm. The universal language of peaceful intention that transcended the barriers of culture and tongue. The child's eyes tracked his movements, but she made no sound beyond that small whimper he had heard before. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her skin had the grayish tinge that spoke of prolonged starvation, and Thomas could count her ribs through the torn fabric of her dress. He spoke softly, though he knew she likely couldn't understand his words. The tone mattered more than the language. the gentle cadence that he used with frightened animals and skittish horses. "Easy now, little one. I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now. I promise you're safe." He reached slowly for his canteen, uncapping it with deliberate movement so she could see exactly what he was doing. Water was precious on the frontier, and offering it was one of the most basic gestures of goodwill a person could make. The child's eyes fixed on the canteen with an intensity that broke Thomas's heart. She was so desperately thirsty that caution warred visibly with need on her small face. Thomas took a drink himself, showing her it was safe, then held it out toward her. She hesitated for only a moment before her survival instinct overcame her fear. Small hands, thin as bird bones, reached out to take the canteen. She drank with the desperate gulping of someone who had been denied water for far too long, and Thomas had to gently stop her before she made herself sick. "Slow, sweetheart. Small sips, or you'll hurt yourself worse." He mimed the motion of small drinks, and after a moment she seemed to understand, forcing herself to drink more slowly, despite every fiber of her being screaming for more. While she drank, Thomas assessed the situation with the practical mindset that had kept him alive through countless frontier challenges. This child was dying, that much was clear. Without intervention, she had days at most, possibly only hours. The question was what had brought her to this desperate state. There were no tracks suggesting she had wandered here on her own, and children her age didn't typically travel alone on the prairie. Someone had left her here, whether through accident or intention he couldn't know. The recent storm might have separated her from her people, or perhaps something darker had occurred. The frontier was full of tragedies that went unrecorded and unmourned, victims of violence or disease or simple misfortune that left no witnesses to tell their stories. What he did know with absolute certainty was that he couldn't leave her here to die. Thomas made his decision in the space of a heartbeat, though he understood the complications it would bring. Taking in a native child during these tensions could be seen as anything from an act of charity to a dangerous provocation, depending on who was doing the looking. Some of his neighbors would call him a fool or worse, claiming he was harboring potential enemies or interfering in matters that were none of his concern. Others might see it as theft, taking a child who belonged to her people regardless of the circumstances that had brought her to this desperate state. But Thomas had never been particularly concerned with other people's opinions when his conscience pointed him in a clear direction, and his conscience was speaking loudly now. The child had finished drinking and was watching him with those impossibly large eyes, waiting to see what this strange white man would do next. Thomas smiled at her, hoping the expression would translate across their cultural divide, then slowly reached for the saddlebag where he kept supplies for long rides. He pulled out a piece of jerked beef, hard and salty but nourishing, and broke off a small portion. Her eyes fixed on the food with the same desperate intensity she had shown the water, and Thomas felt anger rising in his chest at whatever circumstances had brought this innocent to such a state. He handed her the jerky and watched as she forced herself to chew slowly despite her obvious hunger. Smart child, he thought. She understood that eating too quickly would make her sick, that survival required patience, even when every instinct screamed for immediate gratification. While she ate, Thomas retrieved his rifle and scanned the surrounding landscape more carefully. The rocks where he had found her offered some shelter from the elements, which suggested she had been here at least through the previous night's storm. But there were no signs of a camp, no evidence of fire or other travelers, nothing to indicate how she had come to be alone in this remote location. The possibilities troubled him deeply. Had her family been killed by settlers or soldiers, leaving her orphaned and alone? Had disease swept through her village, taking her parents and leaving her to wander until exhaustion claimed her? Or was there something darker at work? Some deliberate cruelty that had placed a child in the wilderness to die, The frontier was full of such stories, acts of violence and abandonment, that decent people preferred not to acknowledge, but which happened with disturbing regularity nonetheless. Whatever the truth, it would have to wait. The immediate priority was getting this child somewhere warm and safe, where he could begin the careful process of nursing her back to health. Thomas gestured to his horse, trying to indicate through simple motions that he wanted to take her with him. The child looked at Copper with uncertainty, clearly unfamiliar with horses in this context. Her people rode, certainly, but perhaps she had never been close to a white man's mount before, or perhaps she was simply too weak and frightened to process what he was asking. Thomas made his decision and moved slowly toward her, giving her time to pull away if she chose. When she didn't retreat, he carefully gathered her into his arms, shocked by how little she weighed. She was light as a bird, all fragile bones and wasted muscle, and he could feel the rapid flutter of her heartbeat against his chest like a trapped sparrow. For a moment she stiffened in his grasp, every muscle tensing with fear or uncertainty, but then something in her seemed to surrender to the inevitable. She was too weak to fight, too desperate for help to refuse it even from a stranger. He settled her carefully in front of his saddle before mounting behind her, one arm wrapped protectively around her small frame to keep her secure. Copper shifted slightly under the additional weight, but accepted the burden with his usual steady temperament. Thomas turned the horse toward home, abandoning his fence inspection for more pressing concerns. The repairs would have to wait. Right now, this child needed food, warmth, and medical attention more urgently than his cattle needed secure boundaries. The ride back to the ranch house took nearly an hour, and Thomas used the time to study the child more carefully. She held herself rigidly at first, clearly uncomfortable with the closeness and the unfamiliar motion of the horse. But gradually, as exhaustion overcame her wariness, she began to relax against him. Her head drooped forward, and he realized she was falling asleep despite her obvious efforts to stay alert. The fact that she could sleep in the arms of a stranger spoke volumes about how thoroughly her strength had been depleted. As they rode, Thomas found himself making plans. He would need to heat water for washing, find clothes that might fit her tiny frame, and prepare food that wouldn't overwhelm her damaged digestive system. Broth first, he decided, something gentle that would provide nourishment without shocking her system. His housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, would know better than he did how to care for a starving child. The Chinese woman had come to the territory 5 years ago, fleeing circumstances she never discussed, and had proven herself invaluable in managing his household. She had a practical wisdom that Thomas respected deeply, and more importantly, she had experience with hunger and deprivation that would serve them well now. The ranch came into view as they crested the final ridge, and Thomas felt a familiar surge of pride at the sight. The barn stood solid and weathered, its red paint faded but its structure sound. The house beyond was modest but well maintained, with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides and windows that caught the morning light. Corrals and outbuildings spread out in organized efficiency, everything positioned with the careful planning of a man who understood that survival on the frontier required attention to detail and preparation for every contingency. Thomas guided Copper directly to the barn rather than the house, instinct telling him that the child might find the enclosed space less overwhelming than his home. He dismounted carefully, mindful of the small body he carried, and settled the child on a bed of clean hay in one of the empty stalls. She was fully asleep now, her breathing shallow but steady, her small face peaceful in a way that made her look even younger than he had initially guessed. Thomas removed his coat and draped it over her like a blanket, the heavy canvas and wool swallowing her tiny frame completely. She stirred slightly at the weight but didn't wake, too exhausted to register anything beyond the basic warmth it provided. Mrs. Chen was in the kitchen when Thomas burst through the door, her expression shifting from surprise to concern as she took in his disheveled appearance and the urgency in his manner. She was a small woman, barely reaching Thomas's shoulder, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed very little. In the 5 years she had worked for him, Thomas had learned that her quiet competence masked a core of steel that had carried her through hardships he could only imagine. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and whatever food we have that would be gentle for someone who's been starving." He spoke quickly, already moving toward the cupboard where medical supplies were kept. "And laudanum if we have any left from when I broke my ribs last year. She's going to need something for pain once she wakes up properly." Mrs. Chen's hands stilled on the bread dough she had been kneading, her sharp eyes studying his face with an intensity that saw past his words to the situation beneath. "Who is starving, Mr. Bridger? What has happened?" Her English carried the slight formality of someone for whom it was a learned language rather than a native tongue, but her meaning was always crystal clear. A child, native girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Thomas pulled down the tin of medical supplies and began sorting through its contents. "I found her near the southern fence line, half dead from exposure and starvation. She's in the barn right now, sleeping." "Mrs. Chen, I've never seen anyone so close to death and still breathing. If we don't get food and warmth into her soon, we'll be digging a grave instead of saving a life." The housekeeper absorbed this information with a single sharp nod, her hands already moving to gather what was needed. She asked no questions about the wisdom of his decision, offered no commentary on the complications this would bring. She simply began heating water on the stove and pulling out the supplies necessary to care for someone in desperate straits. This was one of the qualities Thomas valued most in her, the ability to see what needed doing and do it without wasting time on unnecessary discussion. Within 15 minutes, they had assembled everything necessary and were heading toward the barn, Mrs. Chen carrying a basket of supplies while Thomas managed the heavy pot of heated water. The child was still sleeping when they entered, though she had curled herself into an even tighter ball beneath his coat, seeking warmth and security even in unconsciousness. Mrs. Chen set down her basket and knelt beside the hay, her expression softening in a way Thomas had rarely seen as she studied the small face half hidden by the oversized coat. "She is Shoshone," Mrs. Chen said quietly, her fingers gently brushing a strand of dark hair from the child's forehead. "See the pattern on what remains of her dress and the style of beadwork? My husband traded with the Shoshone before he died. I recognize their craftsmanship." She looked up at Thomas, and he saw both compassion and concern in her eyes. "This will bring trouble, Mr. Bridger. Her people will be looking for her, and when they find she is here, they may not understand your intentions were good." Thomas settled himself on a hay bale, suddenly feeling the weight of what he had set in motion. "I know, but what else could I do? Leave her to die out there because helping her might be inconvenient? Because it might cause problems for me?" He shook his head firmly. "I've never been that kind of man, Chen, and I'm too old to start now. I did not say you should have left her," Mrs. Chen replied with gentle reproach. "I said it will bring trouble. These are different things. Trouble can be managed. A dead child cannot be brought back to life. Now we should clean her and check for injuries before we try to wake her for food. The longer we wait, the more difficult recovery becomes." They worked together with practiced efficiency, Thomas holding the child gently while Mrs. Chen cleaned away the worst of the dirt and examined her for wounds or injuries beyond the obvious malnutrition. The girl barely stirred during the process, though she whimpered occasionally when they touched particularly tender spots. Her feet were badly blistered from walking without proper shoes, and there were bruises on her arms and legs that might have come from falls or from something more sinister. Mrs. Chen's face grew grimmer as the examination continued, her gentle hands cataloging damage that spoke of prolonged suffering. "This child has been alone for many days, perhaps a week or more," the housekeeper said finally, wrapping the small body in clean blankets they had brought from the house. She has walked far, fallen many times, and gone without food and water for longer than most adults could survive. That she still lives is testimony to great strength of spirit. Thomas felt something fierce and protective rising in his chest as he looked at the small bundle in Mrs. Chen's arms. Whatever had happened to bring this child to such desperate circumstances, she had fought with everything in her to survive. That kind of determination deserved to be rewarded, not punished by indifference or cowardice on his part. "Let's get her to the house," he said, standing and reaching for the child. "She'll be more comfortable in the spare bedroom, and we can keep a closer eye on her there. Mrs. Chen, would you prepare that broth we discussed? Something with bone marrow if we have it, and whatever vegetables will add nourishment without being too heavy." The spare bedroom had once belonged to Thomas's younger brother, who had died of fever during their first winter in the territory 15 years ago. Thomas had kept it much as Daniel had left it, unable to bring himself to change the room even though his brother would never return to occupy it. Now, as he laid the native child in the bed where Daniel had spent his final days, Thomas felt the strange symmetry of the moment. This room had witnessed one young life ending, and now perhaps it would see another life saved. Mrs. Chen had followed him upstairs with an armload of additional blankets and a hot brick wrapped in cloth to place at the child's feet. The house was well built and retained heat better than most frontier structures, but the child was so dangerously cold that every measure of warmth mattered. They tucked her into the bed with careful attention, surrounding her small body with warmth while being mindful not to heat her too quickly. Thomas had seen men die from being warmed too fast after severe exposure, their hearts unable to handle the sudden change in temperature. The child's eyes fluttered open briefly as they settled her, those dark pools of awareness taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with evident confusion and fear. Thomas spoke softly to her, maintaining the gentle tone he had used when he first found her. "You're safe now, little one. We're going to take care of you. You're going to be all right." She couldn't understand his words, but something in his manner must have reassured her because her eyes closed again without the panic he had half expected. Mrs. Chen disappeared downstairs to prepare the promised broth while Thomas pulled a chair close to the bedside and settled in to keep watch. He had done this before, sitting vigil beside the sick or injured, and he knew the importance of monitoring someone in such a fragile state. Changes in breathing, sudden fever, the onset of convulsions. All these things could happen quickly in someone as compromised as this child. An immediate response could mean the difference between life and death. As he sat there in the quiet room, listening to the small sounds of the child's breathing and the distant clatter of Mrs. Chen working in the kitchen below, Thomas found himself thinking about the reaction his actions would provoke. His nearest neighbor, Samuel Garrett, was a decent enough man but harbored deep prejudices against the native peoples. He had lost a cousin to a raiding party 5 years back and had never forgiven or forgotten. When Samuel learned that Thomas was sheltering a native child, the response would be anger and accusations of betrayal to his own kind. Then there was the matter of the territorial authorities. The government had policies about native children, most of them involving forced removal to boarding schools where they were stripped of their culture and language in the name of civilization. Thomas had always found such practices abhorrent. This idea that one people's way of life was inherently superior and that children should be torn from their families to be remade in an image not their own. But his personal opinions wouldn't matter much if officials decided this child needed to be taken into government custody. Most troubling of all was the question of the child's own people. Mrs. Chen had identified her as Shoshone, which meant her tribe was likely searching for her even now. The Shoshone of this region had a complex relationship with the white settlers, sometimes peaceful, sometimes hostile, always colored by the broken promises and violent betrayals that had characterized westward expansion. How would they react when they discovered one of their children in the care of a white rancher, Would they see it as kindness or as kidnapping? Would they understand he had saved her life, or would they assume he had taken her for darker purposes? These thoughts occupied Thomas's mind as the afternoon stretched into evening. Mrs. Chen brought the broth, rich with marrow and herbs, and together they woke the child enough to get some of the nourishing liquid into her. She drank weakly, managing only a few spoonfuls before exhaustion claimed her again, but it was a start. Thomas had seen enough recovery from starvation to know that progress would be measured in small increments, that healing from such deprivation was a slow process that could not be rushed. As darkness fell, Thomas lit the lamp on the bedside table and continued his vigil. Mrs. Chen appeared periodically with updates on the evening chores and offers to relieve him, but Thomas declined. Something about this child had touched him deeply, awakening protective instincts he hadn't felt since Daniel's death. Perhaps it was the way she had looked at him with those enormous eyes, so full of intelligence and determination despite her desperate circumstances. Perhaps it was simply that he had been alone too long, his life focused so entirely on the practical matters of survival and ranch management that he had forgotten what it felt like to care for another human being beyond the basic courtesies of frontier neighborliness. Whatever the reason, he found himself unwilling to leave her side for more than brief necessities. He dozed occasionally in the chair, waking whenever her breathing changed or she stirred in the bed. Each time he woke, he checked her temperature with the back of his hand against her forehead, relieved to find no sign of fever developing. Fever would complicate everything, potentially indicating infection or disease that would require more medical knowledge than he possessed. Near midnight, the child woke more fully than she had since he brought her to the house. Her eyes opened and focused on him with clarity, studying his face in the lamplight with an intensity that made him acutely aware of how he must appear to her. A large white man, weathered and worn, sitting beside her bed in the darkness. He must be a frightening figure, whatever his intentions. "Hello there," he said softly, sitting forward slowly so as not to startle her. "How are you feeling? Can you drink some more broth?" He reached for the cup Mrs. Chen had left on the bedside table, still slightly warm from being kept near the lamp. The child watched his movements with the wariness of a wild creature, but when he offered the cup, she accepted it with trembling hands. She managed to drink several swallows before her strength gave out, and Thomas had to support both her and the cup to prevent spilling. When she had finished what she could manage, he set the cup aside and offered her water from a glass, which she accepted more readily. The simple act of drinking seemed to exhaust her, and within moments her eyes were drooping closed again, though she fought against sleep with visible determination. "It's all right to rest," Thomas said gently. "You're safe here. Nothing is going to hurt you while I'm watching." He didn't know if she understood any of his words, but he hoped his tone would convey the meaning behind them. She studied his face for a long moment, those intelligent dark eyes seeming to measure something in his expression. Then, as if she had reached some internal decision about whether he could be trusted, she allowed her eyes to close and her breathing to deepen into sleep. Thomas settled back in his chair, oddly moved by what felt like a gesture of trust from the child. She had chosen to let herself be vulnerable in his presence, chosen to believe that he meant her no harm, despite everything her short life had probably taught her about the dangers of trusting strangers. The weight of that trust sat heavy on his shoulders, a responsibility he had not sought but would not shirk from now that it had been placed upon him. The night passed slowly, measured in the steady rhythm of the child's breathing and the occasional creaking of the house settling around them. Thomas dozed intermittently but never deeply, always aware of the small presence in the bed and ready to respond if she showed signs of distress. Mrs. Chen appeared once near dawn to check on them both, her face softening when she saw Thomas still keeping his vigil. She placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, a rare gesture of physical contact from the normally reserved woman, before disappearing back downstairs to begin the morning's work. As sunlight began filtering through the bedroom window, Thomas became aware of a change in the quality of the child's sleep. She was moving more, making small sounds that suggested she was nearing wakefulness. He straightened in his chair, working the stiffness from his back and neck, and prepared himself for what he suspected would be a more difficult interaction than their brief exchanges during the night. In darkness, disoriented and weak, the child had accepted his care with minimal resistance. In full daylight, with her strength marginally restored, she might react very differently to finding herself in a stranger's house. His prediction proved accurate. When the child's eyes opened and took in the unfamiliar room in clear morning light, panic flashed across her face. She sat up quickly, too quickly for her weakened state, and immediately began looking for escape routes. Her eyes darted from the window to the door, calculating distances and obstacles with the desperate focus of someone accustomed to danger. Thomas remained very still, hands visible and empty, trying to project calm and safety through his posture and expression. "Easy now," he said softly. "I know you're frightened, but I promise you're not in danger here. You were dying when I found you, and I brought you here to help you get better." He gestured to the empty broth cup, then to the water glass, trying to communicate through actions what his words could not. "You're safe here. No one is going to hurt you." The child's chest was heaving with frightened breaths, her eyes still tracking possible exits, but she didn't try to bolt from the bed. Perhaps she recognized that she lacked the strength for flight, or perhaps some part of her remembered the care she had received during the night and hesitated to flee from it. Whatever the reason, she remained in the bed, watching him with the intense focus of someone whose survival had always depended on accurately reading the intentions of others. Thomas made a decision. He stood slowly, keeping his movements obvious and non-threatening, and walked to the door. Then, deliberately, he opened it wide and stepped back, leaving the exit clear and unobstructed. "You can leave if you want to," he said, gesturing to the open doorway. "I won't stop you or chase you. But I hope you'll stay, at least long enough to eat some breakfast and get your strength back." He pointed to himself, then to the door leading downstairs, and made eating motions with his hands. The child stared at him in obvious confusion, as if the concept of a captor offering freedom was so foreign to her experience that she couldn't process it. Her eyes moved from him to the door and back again, clearly trying to understand whether this was some kind of trap or trick. Thomas simply waited, patient and still, letting her work through the decision in her own time. He could see the moment when understanding dawned in her expression, followed quickly by a different kind of wariness, one that suggested she was beginning to believe his stated intentions, but remained uncertain about what those intentions might ultimately mean for her. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, the child's shoulders relaxed fractionally. She didn't smile or give any overt sign of acceptance, but the desperate edge of panic faded from her eyes. Thomas took this as permission to continue and gestured again toward the stairs, indicating that food was available if she wanted it. He then did something that surprised even himself. He turned his back on her and walked out of the room, heading downstairs and leaving her alone with the clear exit he had provided. It was a calculated risk, one that might result in her fleeing the moment he was out of sight. But Thomas understood that trust could not be commanded or coerced. It had to be offered freely and accepted willingly, and the only way to earn this child's trust was to demonstrate through action that he meant what he said. She needed to know that she had agency here, that she was not a prisoner, but a guest who could choose to stay or go as she saw fit. Whether she possessed the strength to actually leave was almost beside the point. What mattered was that he had given her the choice. In the kitchen, Mrs. Chen was preparing breakfast with her usual efficiency. She looked up as Thomas entered, her eyebrows rising in a silent question about the child. "She's awake and frightened," Thomas said, moving to help set the table. I left the door open so she knows she's free to leave if she wants. We'll see if she chooses to come down or if we need to bring food up to her. The housekeeper nodded her understanding and began portioning out extra servings of the soft rice porridge she had prepared, food that would be gentle on a damaged digestive system while still providing needed nourishment. They waited in companionable silence, the morning routine of the ranch continuing around them. Thomas could hear his hired hands beginning their work in the barn and corrals, the familiar sounds of livestock and labor that marked the start of each day. He wondered how long it would take before word spread among his workers that he had brought a native child to the ranch house. Cowboys were notorious gossips, and a development this unusual would be the talk of the bunkhouse by lunchtime and the talk of the entire valley by week's end. The soft sound of footsteps on the stairs brought Thomas's head up sharply. He exchanged a quick glance with Mrs. Chen, both of them trying to appear casual and unthreatening as the child appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was wrapped in one of the blankets from the bed, her small face peering out from the folds of fabric like a cautious animal emerging from its den. Her eyes took in the kitchen with its stone fireplace and wooden table, the shelves of supplies and cooking implements, the morning light streaming through windows that Thomas kept scrupulously clean. Thomas stood slowly and pulled out a chair at the table, gesturing for her to sit. Mrs. Chen ladled porridge into a bowl and set it at the indicated place, along with a spoon and a cup of water. The child approached the table with visible trepidation, clearly torn between hunger and wariness. When she finally sat, perching on the edge of the chair as if ready to flee at any moment, Thomas and Mrs. Chen deliberately turned their attention to their own meals, giving her space to eat without feeling watched or pressured. The child attacked the porridge with desperate hunger, eating so quickly that Thomas feared she would make herself sick. He cleared his throat gently and made slowing motions with his hands, trying to communicate that the food wasn't going anywhere and she could take her time. She paused, looking at him with an expression that might have been embarrassment or simply acknowledgement, then forced herself to eat more slowly. Mrs. Chen refilled her bowl twice before the child finally set down her spoon, her small stomach clearly full beyond its current capacity. "Thank you," the child said suddenly, the words so unexpected that Thomas nearly dropped his coffee cup. She had spoken in English, her pronunciation careful and deliberate, as if the words were ones she had learned but rarely had occasion to use. Thomas stared at her in surprise, and she met his gaze with something that might have been defiance or pride. "I speak some white man words. My father traded with settlers. He said it was important to understand the language of those who would take our lands." The bitterness in her young voice was unmistakable, and Thomas felt the weight of generations of broken promises and violent displacement in those few words. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Mine is Thomas Bridger, and this is Mrs. Chen. We're glad you decided to stay for breakfast." The child studied him for a long moment before answering. "Awanasa. It means my home in your language. But I have no home now. Everyone is gone." The simple statement carried such profound loss that Thomas felt his chest tighten with sympathy. "What happened, Awanasa? Where is your family?" He kept his voice gentle, aware that he was treading on painful ground, but needing to understand the circumstances that had brought her to the brink of death on his property. Awanasa's small hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles going white with the force of emotion she was trying to contain. "The sickness came to our village 2 moons ago. First the elders, then the children, then everyone. My mother and father tried to save people, but the sickness was stronger than their medicine." She paused, her eyes distant with terrible memories. "I was sent away with my grandmother when the dying started. She said young ones might survive if they left before the sickness took hold. But grandmother fell sick on the trail. She told me to keep walking, to find another village of our people. She told me not to look back." Thomas exchanged a glance with Mrs. Chen. both of them recognizing the signs of epidemic disease that regularly devastated native communities. Smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases that white settlers had developed some immunity to but which swept through indigenous populations with devastating mortality rates. Entire villages could be wiped out in a matter of weeks, leaving only scattered survivors to carry on their people's traditions and memories. "How long have you been walking?" Thomas asked quietly. Awanasa's brow furrowed in concentration, clearly trying to count days that had blurred together in a haze of hunger and exhaustion. Many days, many nights. "I counted at first, making marks on a stick like my father taught me, but I lost the stick when I fell in the river." She touched her arm where Thomas had noticed bruising during the examination. "The water was cold and fast. I thought it would take me like it took grandmother, but I caught a branch and pulled myself out. After that, I just walked. I looked for the smoke of cooking fires, listened for voices, but found nothing, only empty land and your fence." The story painted a picture of remarkable resilience and courage. This child had survived exposure, starvation, and a river crossing that might have killed a grown man, all while grieving the loss of her entire family and community. Thomas felt a deep respect for her strength mixing with sorrow for the circumstances that had required such strength from someone so young. "You're very brave, Awanasa," he said simply. "And you're safe now. You can stay here as long as you need to. We'll make sure you have food and shelter and anything else you require." Awanasa looked at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "Why would you help me? Your people take our lands, break your promises, give us sickness. Why would you care if one native child lives or dies?" The question was posed without accusation, as if she genuinely wanted to understand his motivations rather than condemn him for the sins of his race. Thomas considered his answer carefully, aware that what he said now might shape how this child viewed white people for the rest of her life. "Because leaving you to die would have made me a man I couldn't respect when I looked in the mirror each morning. Because you're a child who needed help and the color of your skin doesn't change that basic truth. And because not all white people are the same, just as I imagine not all of your people are the same. Some of us still believe in basic human decency, even if it's becoming rarer than it should be." Mrs. Chen spoke for the first time since Awanasa had entered the kitchen, her accented English carrying a weight of understanding born from her own experiences of displacement and prejudice. "I came to this country with nothing but the clothes I wore, running from men who would have killed me for reasons that had nothing to do with who I was as a person. Mr. Bridger gave me work when others would not, treated me with respect when others saw only a Chinese woman to be used or ignored. Sometimes, child, we find kindness in unexpected places. Sometimes strangers become family when blood family is taken from us." The words seemed to resonate with Awanasa in a way that Thomas's had not. Perhaps it was easier for her to trust someone who had also experienced loss and displacement, someone whose skin color marked her as different from the majority just as Awanasa's did. Whatever the reason, some of the defensive tension in the child's posture eased, and she nodded slowly, as if Mrs. Chen had answered a question she hadn't known how to ask. The sound of horses approaching the house interrupted the moment of connection. Thomas rose and moved to the window, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that hung above the door. 3 riders were coming up the path to the ranch house, and even from a distance he recognized Samuel Garrett's distinctive gray horse in the lead. So it begins, Thomas thought. News had traveled even faster than he had anticipated, and now he would have to defend his decision to help Awanasa to neighbors who would see only complications and dangers in his actions. "Stay in the kitchen with Mrs. Chen," Thomas said to Awanasa, who had gone rigid with fear at the sound of horses. "These are my neighbors, and they may not understand why you're here, but I won't let anyone hurt you or take you away. You have my word on that." He buckled on his gun belt. a gesture that was more about making a statement than expecting actual violence, and stepped out onto the porch to meet his visitors. Samuel Garrett dismounted heavily, his weathered face set in lines of concern and disapproval. The two men with him were the Morrison brothers, who ran a small spread adjacent to Garrett's property. All three were armed, though their weapons remained holstered, and Thomas read their body language as tense but not immediately hostile. "Thomas," Samuel said without preamble, "word has it you've taken in a native child. My ranch hand saw you carrying someone to your house yesterday, and the description he gave suggests it wasn't a white child you found." Thomas leaned against the porch railing, deliberately casual in his posture despite the tension crackling in the air. "Her name is Awanasa. I found her dying of starvation and exposure near my southern fence line. Her entire village was wiped out by disease, and she's been walking alone for weeks, trying to find other members of her tribe. I brought her here because leaving her to die wasn't something I could do and still call myself a decent human being." Samuel's expression hardened. "You know as well as I do that taking in a native child without going through proper channels is going to cause problems. The territorial government has procedures for dealing with orphaned native children. You should have contacted the authorities and let them handle it." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest but kept his voice level. "The authorities would have sent her to one of those boarding schools where they strip away everything that makes a child who they are. They would have cut her hair, forbidden her language, punished her for remembering her family and her people. I've seen what comes out of those schools, Samuel. Broken children who belong nowhere, who've lost their culture but will never be accepted as white no matter how hard they try to become something they're not. I won't be party to that kind of cruelty, not when I have the means to provide care for a child who's lost everything." One of the Morrison brothers spoke up, his voice carrying less hostility than Samuel's but still troubled. "But Thomas, what about when her people come looking for her? And they will come, you know that. The Shoshone don't abandon their children. When they find out a white rancher has one of their young ones, they're going to assume the worst. You could be starting a war over this." Thomas had thought about this extensively during his long night of vigil. "If her people come, I'll explain what happened and return her to them with my blessing. I'm not trying to steal a child from her tribe, Samuel. I'm trying to keep her alive long enough that there's still a child to return. Her entire village was wiped out by disease. For all I know, she's the only survivor. What was I supposed to do? Leave her to die alone because helping her might be politically complicated?" Samuel's jaw worked as he struggled with some internal conflict. Finally he said, his voice rough with emotion, "You know I lost my cousin Jack to a native raiding party. You were at the funeral. You saw what they did to him. How can you expect me to feel anything but anger when I see you protecting one of them?" The pain in Samuel's voice was genuine, and Thomas softened his own tone in response. "I was there, Samuel, and I remember. Jack was a good man who didn't deserve what happened to him. But Awanasa didn't kill Jack. She wasn't even born when that raid happened. She's a 7-year-old child who watched her parents die of white man's diseases, who's been wandering alone trying to survive, who's done nothing to deserve being punished for crimes committed by people who happen to share her ancestry." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "If we judge every individual by the worst actions of their race or tribe, then we're all guilty of horrors we never personally committed. I'm asking you to see this child as what she is, an innocent who needs help, not as a symbol of everything you hate about the conflicts between our peoples." The silence that followed was heavy with consideration. The Morrison brothers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the position they found themselves in. Samuel stared at the porch boards, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with conflicted emotion. "I don't like this, Thomas. I think you're making a mistake that's going to bring trouble down on all of us. But I also know you're one of the few honest men left in this territory, and if you say you're doing right by this child, then I have to trust your judgment even when I disagree with it." Thomas felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying drain from his shoulders. "Thank you, Samuel. I know this isn't easy for you, and I respect that you're willing to trust me despite your reservations." The older rancher nodded curtly, then remounted his horse. The Morrison brothers followed suit, though the younger one paused before leaving. "If there's trouble, Thomas, you send word. We may not agree with what you're doing, but we don't abandon our neighbors when things get difficult." The three riders departed, leaving Thomas alone on the porch with his thoughts. He remained there for several minutes, watching them disappear down the trail and considering the weight of the responsibility he had assumed. Then he turned and went back inside, where he found Awanasa standing just inside the door, clearly having heard at least part of the conversation. "That man lost someone to my people," she said. It was a statement rather than a question. "Yes," Thomas confirmed, seeing no point in lying to her. "His cousin was killed in a raid several years ago. He's angry and hurting, and sometimes people in pain lash out at anything that reminds them of their loss. But he's also a fundamentally decent man who's willing to question his own anger. That's rarer than you might think." Awanasa nodded slowly, processing this information with the same grave intelligence she had shown throughout their interactions. "Will more white people come? People who are not decent like that man? People who want to hurt me or take me away?" Thomas wished he could tell her no, could promise her absolute safety and certainty. But he had never been a man who offered false comfort when truth was called for. "Maybe. Probably, if I'm being honest, but I meant what I said. I won't let anyone hurt you or take you against your will. You're under my protection now, and I take that responsibility seriously." The child studied his face for a long moment, then nodded with a solemnity that seemed far too old for her years. "I believe you. I do not think my father would have trusted you, but my grandmother said that sometimes the spirits send help from unexpected places. Maybe you are the help the spirits sent for me." Thomas didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance and solidarity. Mrs. Chen appeared from the kitchen, practical as always. "The child needs rest and more food, and you, Mr. Bridger, need to tend to your ranch. Life does not stop because we have complications." She was right, of course. Thomas spent the next week in a strange state of heightened awareness, constantly watching the horizon for signs of approaching riders while trying to maintain the normal routines of ranch life. Awanasa remained in the house, gradually regaining strength under Mrs. Chen's careful nurturing. The housekeeper had a gift for coaxing the child to eat properly, preparing small meals throughout the day that rebuilt Awanasa's wasted frame without overwhelming her damaged digestive system. By the end of the first week, color had returned to the child's face, and she could walk without trembling from weakness. During this time, Thomas learned more about Awanasa's life before the sickness had destroyed her village. She spoke of her father, a respected hunter and trader, who had insisted she learn English because he believed understanding the white settlers was essential to her people's survival. Her mother had been a skilled craftswoman whose beadwork was sought after by other tribes. Awanasa had been learning both parents' skills, spending mornings with her mother learning patterns and designs that carried spiritual meaning, and afternoons with her father learning to track game and read the signs of weather and season in the natural world. The picture that emerged was of a childhood rich with love and learning, abruptly shattered by disease and loss. Thomas found himself growing increasingly protective of this solemn child who had survived so much, and he began to dread the day when her people would come to reclaim her. Not because he wanted to keep her from her tribe, but because sending her away would mean losing someone who had unexpectedly filled spaces in his life he hadn't realized were empty. On the 8th morning after finding Awanasa, Thomas woke before dawn with an inexplicable sense of unease. He dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Mrs. Chen already in the kitchen, her face troubled. "Something is different this morning," she said quietly. "The birds are too quiet. The horses in the corral are restless. I think perhaps today is the day you have been expecting." Thomas nodded, feeling the same atmospheric tension that Mrs. Chen had identified. He checked his rifle and pistol, not with any intention of using them against Awanasa's people, but simply because being prepared was second nature to a man who had survived 2 decades on the frontier. Then he went to wake Awanasa, knowing she should be aware that her tribe might have finally found her. The child took the news with the same grave composure she showed toward everything. "If they have come, then the spirits have guided them to me. I should meet them properly, not hiding in your house like I am ashamed." Thomas felt pride swell in his chest at her courage. She was right, of course. Hiding would only make the situation more complicated and potentially more dangerous. As the sun rose, Thomas stationed himself on the porch while Awanasa stood beside him, dressed in clean clothes Mrs. Chen had altered to fit her small frame. They didn't have to wait long. Just after sunrise, movement on the eastern ridge caught Thomas's attention. Riders were appearing along the ridgeline, silhouetted against the morning sky. Not 3 or 4 riders, but dozens. As he watched in growing astonishment, more and more warriors appeared until the entire ridge seemed to be lined with mounted figures. Mrs. Chen joined them on the porch, her sharp intake of breath confirming that she was seeing what Thomas was seeing. "That is many warriors, Mr. Bridger, more than I have ever seen gathered in one place." Awanasa stood perfectly still, her small hand reaching out to grip Thomas's much larger one. "That is my people's way. When searching for a lost child, all who can ride will join the search. It is our greatest shame to lose our young ones, our greatest duty to bring them home safely." The warriors began descending from the ridge in a formation that was both beautiful and intimidating. They moved with practiced precision, their horses responding to subtle commands as they navigated the slope. As they drew closer, Thomas could make out individual details: painted faces, weapons held ready but not raised, ceremonial decorations that suggested this was a formal gathering rather than a war party. When they reached the flat ground before Thomas's ranch, they spread out in a long line that seemed to stretch forever. Thomas's ranch hands had emerged from the bunkhouse and stood frozen, staring at the assembled warriors with expressions ranging from fear to awe. Thomas called out to them, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Stand down, all of you. These people are here for the child. There will be no violence unless someone does something stupid, so I'm asking you all to keep your heads and your hands away from your weapons." The warriors continued to arrive until Thomas estimated there were at least 400, possibly 450, mounted figures arrayed before his property. It was the largest gathering of native warriors he had ever seen, and the sight would have been terrifying if not for the fact that they made no aggressive moves. They simply sat their horses in dignified silence, waiting for something that Thomas didn't yet understand. Then from the center of the line, 3 riders moved forward. One was clearly a chief or elder, his bearing radiating authority despite his advanced age. The other 2 were warriors in their prime, their faces painted with symbols Thomas didn't recognize. They approached to within 20 feet of the porch and stopped, the elder's eyes moving from Thomas to Awanasa and back again. The silence stretched out, laden with meaning and tension. Then Awanasa released Thomas's hand and stepped forward, speaking in her own language for the first time since he had found her. The words flowed from her in a rapid stream, and Thomas wished desperately that he could understand what she was saying. The elder listened without interruption, his weathered face showing no emotion. When Awanasa finally finished speaking, she turned and gestured toward Thomas, clearly including him in whatever story she was telling. The elder's eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made him feel as though his soul was being measured and judged. Then the elder spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the distance despite his age. His words were in English, heavily accented, but perfectly comprehensible. The child tells us you found her dying and brought her to your home, that you fed her, gave her warmth, protected her from those who would have taken her to the white man's schools, that you asked nothing in return and offered her freedom to leave whenever she wished. Is this truth? Thomas met the elder's gaze steadily. It is. She was near death when I found her. I couldn't leave her to die, and I couldn't send her to people who would erase everything that makes her who she is. I've kept her safe and cared for her, hoping her people would come so she could be returned to where she belongs. The elder nodded slowly, then turned his horse and spoke in his own language to the assembled warriors. What followed was something Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. As one, every warrior dismounted from his horse. Then, in a movement so synchronized it seemed choreographed, they each dropped to one knee, their heads bowed toward Thomas and the small child standing beside him. 450 warriors, representing the gathered strength of the Shoshone Nation, kneeling in unified acknowledgement of something that Thomas was only beginning to understand. The elder remained mounted, speaking again in English so Thomas could comprehend the significance of what was happening. Among our people, children are sacred. They carry our future, our stories, our continuity as a nation. When a child is lost, all who can search will search. When a child is in danger, all who can fight will fight. The old man's voice carried the weight of centuries of tradition. This child is the last survivor of her village, the only one who carries the memories and songs of her people. She is precious beyond measure, and you saved her life when you could have turned away. He gestured to the kneeling warriors. These men have ridden for 8 days searching for this child. They have crossed mountains and rivers, left their own families and responsibilities, all to bring home one small girl. That is the value we place on our young ones. And you, a stranger, a white man with every reason to fear or ignore a native child, you did what many of our own people could not do. You found her when we could not. You saved her when we were not there to protect her. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. I only did what any decent person would do. The elder shook his head firmly. Number. Many would not have done what you did. Many would have looked away or handed her to authorities who would have stolen her spirit while claiming to save her body. You saw a child who needed help, and you helped without thought of reward or recognition. This is the mark of a man whose heart speaks true. He raised his hand, and the warriors rose as one, a coordinated movement that spoke of deep discipline and unity. Then the elder addressed Thomas again. Our people have a tradition. When someone saves the life of one of our children, they become bound to us in a way that transcends the divisions between our peoples. You have earned honor that few white men have ever known, and we wish to acknowledge this debt properly. Thomas opened his mouth to protest that no debt existed, but the elder continued speaking. We cannot give you gold or land, for we have little of either that the white man has not already taken. But we can offer you something of greater value. From this day forward, you are under the protection of the Shoshone Nation. Any who threaten you threaten all of us. Any who help you honor all of us. Your ranch, your livestock, your safety. These things are now matters of concern to every warrior you see before you. The implications of what the elder was saying slowly dawned on Thomas. This was not just gratitude, but a formal alliance being offered. A covenant of protection that would shield him from the conflicts and dangers that regularly threatened frontier ranchers. But more than that, it was recognition of shared humanity, an acknowledgement that decency and compassion could bridge divides that politics and violence had created. What about Awanasa? Thomas asked, looking down at the child who still stood beside him. She belongs with her people, but her village is gone. Where will she go? The elder's expression softened as he looked at the small girl. She will come with us and be raised by her mother's sister, who has offered to take her as her own daughter. She will learn the ways of our people, remember the songs of her village, and grow strong in the knowledge that she survived when all others fell. She will be honored for her strength and courage." Awanasa looked up at Thomas, her dark eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing me as a person when you could have seen only a native child, for treating me with kindness when others would have shown only fear or hate. I will remember you always, Thomas Bridger, and I will tell my children and grandchildren about the white man who saved me because it was the right thing to do." Thomas knelt down so he was at her eye level, his own vision blurring with emotion. "You're a remarkable young woman, Awanasa. Your parents would be proud of how strong you've been, how bravely you've faced everything that's happened. Never forget where you came from. Never let anyone tell you that your people's ways are less valuable than anyone else's. The world needs people like you who carry their culture with pride and dignity." She hugged him then, fiercely, and Thomas held her small frame carefully, aware that this was goodbye. When she finally pulled away, she walked toward the elder's horse with her head held high, accepting the hand that pulled her up behind the saddle. The elder nodded to Thomas one final time, a gesture of profound respect between equals. "Remember, Thomas Bridger, you have friends among the Shoshone. That friendship will not be forgotten." Then the warriors remounted in another synchronized movement and began to turn their horses back toward the ridge.